She had a shotgun leveled at his chest on his own porch. And the worst part was, she had every right to. Gideon Mercer had been gone 26 months. He'd left behind a dying ranch, a mountain of debt, and the quiet certainty that when he returned, there'd be nothing left worth coming back to. But the pastures were green, the fences stood straight, the cattle were fat and healthy in the late summer heat, and standing between him and his own front door was a woman he'd never seen before in his life, with mud on her boots, fire in her eyes, and a finger resting easy on the trigger. "This is my land," he said. "Prove it," she said right back. "If you've ever been a stranger in the place you were supposed to call home, stay with me. This story is for you. Watch all the way to the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The summer of 1883 had been the kind that cracked the earth open. West Texas in August didn't ask permission to be brutal. It just was, flat, baked, and indifferent to whoever was foolish enough to try and work it. The sky stayed white by noon, the color bleached right out of it, and the scrub grass along the creek beds curled at the edges like old paper held too close to a flame. A man riding in from the south would feel it on the back of his neck first. That particular dry heat that wasn't just temperature, but something personal. Like the land itself was taking stock of him. Gideon Mercer felt it the same as always. He'd grown up under that sky, and he supposed he'd die under it too, and somewhere between those two facts, he'd spent the better part of 41 years trying to make something worth dying over. The Mercer Ranch, 800 acres of hard-won Texas ground north of the Cimarron River, was supposed to be that thing. He wasn't sure it still was. He'd left in the spring of 1881 with $16 to his name and a contract to drive 400 head of cattle up to Abilene for Clayton Holt, a rancher out of Del Rio, who'd offered him top-hand wages plus a cut of the sale. It was good money, better than anything Gideon could scrape together on land that had gone 3 seasons without a decent rain. The bank note on the property was 90 days past due when he left. He'd told himself he'd be back inside of 8 months, and that the money from the drive would square the debt and buy him another year. That had been his plan. Plans had a way of coming apart on a cattle drive. The first drive stretched into a second contract. A bad stretch through the Indian Territory had cost them 6 weeks and 30 head of cattle to a sickness nobody could name. Then Clayton Holt died of a heart seizure outside of Dodge City, and the whole operation went sideways through 3 weeks of legal wrangling over the estate before anyone got paid. By the time Gideon had his money and his bearings, summer had come back around and the drive north had turned into a drive east and then a drive back south, and 2 years had slipped by him the way time does when you're working too hard to watch it go. He'd written twice. Once to the Braxton County Bank, promising payment. Once to a neighbor, old Cal Dempsey, asking him to keep an eye on the property. Cal had written back once, a short letter in bad handwriting, saying the place looked rough but standing. Then nothing more. Now Gideon rode up the long dirt track toward the house and tried to prepare himself for what he was about to find. He didn't find what he expected. The first thing he noticed was the fence line along the eastern pasture. He'd left it sagging in 3 places. He remembered it clearly because he'd meant to fix it before he left and run out of time. It was straight now. New posts, new wire, set proper and taut the way fence was supposed to be. He slowed his horse without meaning to and looked at it for a long moment before he kept riding. The second thing was the cattle. He'd left 37 head behind when he went, mostly older animals he couldn't move without a full drive crew, and 2 cows that were too close to calving to travel. He'd counted on losing most of them. 3 seasons of poor grazing, nobody to push them to the better grass or pull them back from the bad water, and a bank that would have been within its rights to seize them against the note. He'd made his peace with arriving to an empty pasture. There were cattle in the south field, more than 37. He counted close to 60 from the track and stopped counting because his mind wouldn't quite accept what his eyes were showing him. The grass in the south field was grazed but not stripped. Whoever had managed this land had moved the herd, rotating them. He could tell by the way the north field showed fresh growth. It wasn't luck. It was work. Deliberate, knowledgeable work. He rode the rest of the way to the house at a slower pace than he'd planned, his mind working at the puzzle of it, and then he came around the bend in the track where the cottonwoods opened up and he saw the porch and the woman standing on it. She was maybe 25, though it was hard to say. She had the kind of face that outdoor work gave a person, weathered past her years but not broken by it. Brown hair pulled back practical under a hat that had seen hard use. A canvas work shirt, dungarees, boots caked with the red clay from the creek bottom. She was holding a shotgun. Not raised, not threatening, just held, the barrel down but her grip easy and ready. Like a person who'd learned through experience that it was better to be holding it when company arrived than scrambling for it after. She watched him come up the track without moving. Gideon pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard and looked at the woman and then at his house. The house that had a new board across the porch step he'd meant to fix, and a patched place on the roof over the kitchen, and a kitchen garden off the east side that he had definitely not planted. And then back at the woman. "This is my land," he said. She looked at him with eyes the color of creek water, neither warm nor cold, just measuring. "Prove it," she said. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. He could hear that. It was the voice of someone who'd been lied to enough times that they'd stopped taking claims at face value. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded deed he'd been carrying the whole ride home. Not because he thought he'd need it, but because a man who's been gone 2 years worries about things, and held it out across the yard. She came down off the porch steps without rushing, took the paper from him, read it. Not a quick glance. Actually read it, which told him she could, which in 1883 in West Texas was not something you assumed about anyone. She handed it back. "Gideon Mercer," she said. "That's right. I'm Rosalind Avery." She looked at him the same steady way. "I've been working this property for 14 months. He got down from the horse slowly. His back had been bothering him since the Pecos River crossing 2 weeks ago, and it announced itself when he dismounted. A tight pull along his left side that he'd learned not to favor because favoring it only made it worse. "On whose authority?" he asked. "My own," she said. "There wasn't anybody else." He didn't put her out that night. He told himself it was because it was late and he was tired and he needed to think clearly before he made any decisions, which was true enough. But there was also the matter of the supper she put on the table without being asked, cornbread and beans and salt pork, simple but hot. And the way she did it without any performance of hospitality, just set the food down and ate her own portion across from him like they were 2 workers at the end of a day, which in some sense they were. She slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been a storage room when he left. She'd cleared it out and made it habitable, a cot, a trunk, a hook on the wall for her coat. The door had a latch on the inside. He noticed that. Gideon lay in his own bed that night and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the situation he'd ridden into. In the morning, he walked the property. All of it, the full 800 acres, or as much as he could cover on foot and horseback by mid-afternoon. He'd been ranching this land for 11 years, and he knew every piece of it. The good sections and the problem sections, where the water ran sweet and where it went alkaline in dry spells, where the grass grew thick and where the hardpan made grazing sparse. She'd handled all of it correctly. Not perfectly. There were things he'd have done differently. A water trough near the north pasture that was positioned badly for drainage, and a section of fence along the western boundary that had been repaired with a different gauge wire and would need replacing properly before winter. But the fundamental judgments, where to graze, how often to rotate, which animals to cull, how to manage the water in a dry season, all of those had been made correctly by someone who understood cattle and land. When he got back to the yard, she was working on the tack, oiling a length of harness leather that had dried out. She didn't look up. "Where'd you learn to work cattle?" he asked. "My father's ranch," she said, "outside of Laredo. I grew up working it." "What happened to it?" "She kept working the leather." "Lost it. Bank took it 2 years ago." "And you ended up here how?" She set the harness down then and looked at him, and he could see her deciding how much of it to tell him. Not because she was hiding anything, he thought, but because the telling of it had become something she was careful with, something she'd learned to ration out to people who'd earned it. "I came through Braxton County looking for work," she said. "There wasn't much. I did what there was. Laundry, mending, some cooking at the hotel. I heard about this place from Cal Dempsey. He said the owner had gone north on a drive and hadn't come back, and the bank was about 3 months from taking the property. He said nobody wanted to work it because," she paused, "because of the condition it was in." "And you did." "I asked the bank for a temporary arrangement, manager named Horton. He laughed at me." She said it flat. No particular bitterness in it, like she'd stored the bitterness somewhere else a long time ago. I told him I'd work the land and maintain the property against the note coming due, and that any profits from livestock sales would go against the debt. He told me no woman was going to run a cattle operation in Braxton County. Gideon waited. I came out here anyway, she said. The property was abandoned. Nobody was using it. I wasn't squatting. I made records of everything. Every day I worked it, every head I moved or sold, every repair, every dollar against the note. I sent written notice to the bank every 30 days. And Horton? He sent a man out twice to tell me to leave. She picked up the harness again. I showed him my records both times and told him I'd take the matter to the county clerk if he tried to forcibly remove me without going through proper process. He didn't like that, but he didn't send anybody a third time. Gideon rubbed the back of his neck and looked out at the south pasture. 60 head of healthy cattle in good grass on land that should have been bank property for a year. How much is left on the note? He asked. $42 and some change, she said. I have it written down. He looked at her. You knocked down a debt that was 3 months past due to $42. In 14 months. $42.11, she said. I can show you the ledger. She could, and she did. A composition book filled in her neat, careful handwriting, every transaction recorded with date and amount. Livestock sales at the Braxton County Market. 2 sales of cut lumber from timber she'd cleared off the north field. A payment from a neighboring rancher named Pete Whitmore, who'd paid her to move his stray cattle off the property twice. Every penny accounted for and applied against the bank note in documented order. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at that ledger. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't. I mean, I didn't know anybody. I didn't think anyone would. He stopped. I didn't have any right to expect this. No, she said. You didn't. It wasn't cruel, the way she said it, just honest. What do you want? He asked. For what you've done here. What do you need from me? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the cattle made their low sounds in the afternoon heat, and a meadowlark called once from somewhere in the direction of the creek. I want to keep working, she said. I don't need charity, and I don't need pity. I need honest wages for honest work, and I need it understood that I know what I'm doing, and I'll be treated accordingly. That's all? She looked at him steadily. That's everything, she said. He gave her the arrangement she asked for. He didn't think too hard about it. It was the only fair thing, and Gideon Mercer had always cared more about what was fair than what was easy. He paid off the remaining bank note the following week with the money from his drive wages, and he rode back out to the property with a receipt from old Horton's office. Horton himself had been replaced 6 months prior by a new manager, a young man named Ferris, who at least had the decency to look embarrassed about how the previous arrangement had been handled. He also hired on 2 seasonal hands, brothers named Tom and Cale Ridley, who came recommended by Pete Whitmore, and who turned out to be competent enough. They took Rosalind's direction without complaint, mostly because Pete Whitmore had told them she knew what she was doing before they arrived, and also because within the first 3 days it was obvious to anyone paying attention that she did. What he hadn't prepared himself for was Braxton. The town of Braxton sat 8 miles from the ranch, a proper frontier town that had grown up around the cattle trade. A main street with a feed store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a dry goods, a land office, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. Gideon had been part of the Braxton community his entire adult life. He knew everybody. He'd served 2 terms on the water board. He'd helped rebuild the feed store after the fire of 1878. He understood the social geography of the place the way you understand the land you grew up on, intuitively, without having to think about it. The first time he brought Rosalind into town for supplies, he understood inside of an hour how much harder her 14 months had been than she'd let on. It wasn't any single thing. It was the way Dora Hatch at the dry goods went stiff and formal and added 10 cents to the price of flour that she hadn't charged the week before when Gideon had come in alone. It was the 2 ranchers' wives outside the feed store who stopped talking when Rosalind walked by and then started again with their heads close together. It was the way Harlan Dupree, who owned one of the saloons and fancied himself an authority on frontier propriety, made a comment loud enough to carry about strays that didn't know their place. Rosalind didn't flinch at any of it. She moved through the town with the same steady economy she brought to everything, got what was needed, paid fair prices, didn't engage with what wasn't worth engaging with. But Gideon saw her jaw tighten once, outside the land office, when two men he'd known for years crossed to the other side of the street rather than pass near her on the boardwalk. On the ride back, he said, "How long has that been going on?" "Since the first week," she said. She was watching the road, not him. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault." "I know it's not my fault. I'm still sorry it happened." She glanced at him then. A woman without family, without a clear story for why she's where she is, doing work that people have decided she shouldn't be doing. It was going to happen. She paused. "Some of them think I'm—" She stopped, chose different words. "The stories people have decided to tell about me aren't kind." "What stories?" "That I'm not a decent woman, that I have an arrangement with you that isn't a work arrangement." She said it plainly, no heat in her voice. "That I drove the previous hands off the property by scheming and manipulating, that the records I kept are falsified." She looked at the road again. "Pick any story that explains a woman doing something she isn't supposed to be able to do, and someone in Braxton has settled on it." Gideon didn't say anything for a while. He turned the information over in his mind the way he turned difficult things over, carefully, without rushing. "The records aren't falsified," he said. "I've been over every line." "I know that. And any man in this county who wants to claim otherwise is going to have to do it standing in front of me." She looked at him sideways. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm not offering to fight your battles," he said. "I'm saying I know what's true, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of other people's comfort." They rode in silence for a while after that. The land spread flat and gold on either side of the track, cottonwoods marking the creek line to the north. The Mercer Ranch buildings just visible against the sky ahead. "You should know," she said finally, "that it's going to cost you, standing beside me. It's going to cost you standing in this community." "Maybe," he said. "I'm not much worried about it." "You should be." "Why?" She was quiet again. Then, "Because there's something bigger happening in this valley than people's opinions of me. I've been watching it for 14 months, and I don't think I've seen the whole shape of it yet. But I think it's going to matter who people trust and who they don't before this is done." Gideon looked at her. "What have you seen?" She took a slow breath. "You know Edgar Blackridge?" Everyone knew Edgar Blackridge. He'd come to Braxton County 7 years ago from somewhere east, no one was quite certain where, with enough money to buy the old Larson spread and enough personality to get himself elected to the Valley Water Board within 2 years. He owned the biggest operation in the county now, close to 3,000 acres with water rights on the Cimarron, that made him the effective gatekeeper for half the valley's irrigation. He was charming in the way that powerful men in frontier towns were always charming, generously, publicly, in ways that made sure you remembered who you were charming to. "I know him," Gideon said. "He came to the ranch," she said, "twice while you were gone. First time, he offered to buy the property, said he'd cover the bank note and give me enough to relocate comfortably. You told him no. I told him it wasn't my property to sell. He said that was a technical matter easily resolved." She said it dryly. "The second time he came, the offer was gone. He told me the banknote was going to be called early and that I should start making arrangements. Said he had an understanding with the bank." Gideon frowned. "The bank can't call a note early without cause." "No," she said. "They can't." But he didn't know that I'd been sending written notice to the county clerk as well as the bank every month. I had a legal record of my arrangement. He couldn't move the note without it becoming a matter of public record. She paused. He wasn't happy about that. I imagine not. "It made me curious," she said, "about how many other properties in this valley he's made similar arrangements with, and whether those property owners knew their rights as well as I happened to know mine." The sun was getting low ahead of them, throwing long orange light across the flat ground and turning the grass the color of rust. Gideon rode and thought. "You think he's been doing this systematically," he said. "I think a man who tried it twice on a property he knew was in dispute, on a woman he assumed had no recourse, probably didn't start with me," Rosalind said. The Ridley brothers settled in well enough. Tom, the older one, was 28 and deliberate about everything he did, a careful worker, slow to speak, reliable in the way that mattered most, which was that he did what he said he would and showed up when he was supposed to. Cale was 23 and had the energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to pace himself, which made him useful for the work that required brute effort and occasionally needed managing when he got too far ahead of himself. They both, Gideon noticed, addressed Rosalind as Miss Avery and waited for her read on a situation before offering their own, which in ranch work was the right instinct, and said something good about Pete Whitmore's recommendation. The four of them settled into a working routine that surprised Gideon with how quickly it felt normal. He'd been on drives or alone for so long that he'd half forgotten what it was like to have a household functioning around a shared purpose. Breakfast was early, before light, because the cattle needed moving before the worst of the heat. Supper was late, after the evening feeding and check. The hours in between were work, constant and practical. He learned things about Rosalind Avery in those early weeks that she hadn't told him directly. She knew more about livestock medicine than any woman he'd ever met, and several men besides. She'd diagnosed a respiratory condition in 2 of the younger steers within her first week on the property and treated it correctly with a steam treatment she'd learned from somewhere, probably her father's ranch. She was a better shot than Tom Ridley and a better rider than Cale, which Kyle took as a personal challenge and spent 2 weeks trying to disprove before he accepted it with the good grace of someone who'd learned something useful. She was also, he discovered, almost completely alone in the way that people are alone when they've been moving too long and haven't let themselves settle. He found this out indirectly, the way you find out most things about people who don't talk much about themselves. He'd ridden into Braxton one afternoon for feed and stopped to talk with Pete Whitmore, who'd asked how the new arrangement was working out. When Gideon said it was working out well, Pete had said, carefully, that he was glad to hear it and that he hoped people in town were coming around. "They're not much," Gideon said. Pete had looked at his boots. "I'm sorry I didn't do more," he said, "when she was out there alone. I knew it wasn't right how she was being treated, but I've got my own family, my own standing in this community. It's easier to talk about doing right than to do it. She didn't tell me anyone helped her." "Nobody much did," Pete said. Gideon rode home with that sitting on him. That evening, after supper, when the Ridley brothers had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, he said to Rosalind, "Pete Whitmore sends his regards." She was washing dishes. "That's kind of him." He said he should have done more. "When you were out here alone." She was quiet for a moment. "He paid me for moving his cattle. That was honest work, honestly paid. That matters." He meant more than that. "I know what he meant." She dried her hands. "People do the best they can with what they have. I don't have much use for holding it against them that their best wasn't enough." "That's a generous thing to say about people who left you to manage alone for over a year." She turned to look at him, and for just a moment the composure she kept so steady slipped enough for him to see what was behind it. Not bitterness, exactly, but something older and more settled, like scar tissue over a wound that had healed badly, but healed. "I've been on my own for a long time," she said. "I stopped being surprised by it a while back. What surprised me—" She stopped. "What?" he asked. She looked at the window instead of him. "What surprised me was this place," she said. "This land. I came out here expecting a wreck and found it wasn't a wreck. It was hurt, but it wasn't ruined. It just needed somebody to pay attention to it." She paused. "I needed somewhere to be. The land needed someone to work it." That seemed like enough. Gideon didn't say anything. Outside, a coyote called once from the direction of the south pasture, and one of the cattle answered with a low complaint. "You could have left," he said finally. "When Blackridge came, when the bank got difficult, you had no obligation." "I know." "So why didn't you?" She was quiet for a long time. "Because leaving is what I'd always done," she said. "When things got hard, when it wasn't working, I left. I got good at it, and I thought if I left this too, I was never going to stop." She said it simply, without self-pity, like a fact she'd worked out on her own and made peace with. "So I stayed." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm glad you did," he said. She nodded once, a small movement, and turned back to the dishes. "Chaw it." It was Tom Ridley who first brought him the specific name that changed things. Tom had ridden into Braxton on a Tuesday to pick up salt and had gotten into conversation at the feed store with a man named Obadiah Stearns, who ran a small ranch about 6 miles north of the Cimarron. Stearns was a careful, methodical man who'd been working his land for 15 years and who, Tom reported, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 2. He said his water rights assessment came back wrong, Tom said, standing in the yard the next morning. Said the county sent out a man to reassess all the water rights along the North Creek 3 months ago. Now they're saying his allocation is half what the original survey showed. Gideon looked at him. The county sent a man? That's what Stearns said. Official looking, papers and everything. He signed them. Who authorized the reassessment? Tom shifted his weight. That's the thing. Stearns looked into it after. Went to the county clerk. The clerk said there wasn't any reassessment ordered, no record of it. The silence stretched out. Rosalind was in the barn doorway. She hadn't been in the conversation, but she'd heard it, and when Gideon looked at her, her expression said what he was already thinking. Stearns isn't the only one, she said. How do you know? Because I talked to Martha Kinney at the dry goods last week, she said. Her husband had the same thing happen in the spring. And the Delacroix family, over on the South Branch, they got a letter from the bank saying their note had been sold to a private holding company and the terms had changed. She paused. The holding company is called Cimarron Basin Properties. Gideon had never heard of it. I have, she said. I looked it up at the land office 3 months ago. It was incorporated in Austin 18 months back. The registered agent is a man named Gerald Croft. She looked at him steadily. Gerald Croft is Edgar Blackridge's lawyer. The morning was warm already, the first heat building along the horizon. A hawk turned lazy circles over the south pasture. How long have you been looking into this? Gideon asked. Since Blackridge came to this ranch the second time, she said. Since he told me he had an understanding with the bank. I thought, if he said that to me with nothing to gain from it except making me afraid, what was he saying to people who didn't know they had options? You've been collecting this for months. I've been paying attention, she said. I keep records. It's what I do. Gideon looked at his foreman and then at the woman who had saved his ranch and, it was becoming clear, had spent 14 months watching something much larger than his ranch take shape around them. Show me everything you have, he said. She went inside and came back with a second composition book, thicker than the first one and the handwriting smaller, packed tighter. The writing of someone who'd been trying to get down as much as possible in as little space as they had. He sat on the porch steps and opened it. She sat beside him, not close, but close enough to explain what she'd written when it needed explaining, which it did, because she'd been careful and thorough, and some of what she'd documented required the context she'd accumulated along with it. They sat there for 2 hours while the morning built around them, and by the time he closed the book, Gideon Mercer understood that whatever he'd thought he was writing home to, it wasn't this. This isn't just about this ranch, he said. No, Rosalind said. It never was. He handed the book back to her. She held it against her chest with both hands. What do you want to do with this? He asked. She looked out over the pasture, at the healthy cattle in the good grass, at the straight fence line, at the land that had been hurt and then healed because someone had cared enough to stay. I want to do what's right, she said. Whatever that costs. He nodded slowly. Then we do what's right, he said. Together. She turned and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, because Rosalind Avery wasn't a woman who softened easily, and he was already beginning to understand that about her. But something settled. Some small, long-held tension that she'd been carrying alone releasing just slightly, just enough to see. All right, she said. The hawk came around one more time over the south pasture, and then peeled off north toward the river. Down by the bunkhouse, Tom and Cale were arguing about something in their easy, low-grade way. The cattle moved in the morning light, slow and purposeful, the way cattle do when the grass is good and the water is clean, and someone has been paying attention to them. Gideon Mercer had come home expecting ruins. What he'd found instead was something he didn't have a name for yet, something fragile and complicated and already more valuable than the land itself, though he wasn't ready to say so out loud. He stood up off the porch steps and looked at the ranch he'd been given back. All right, he said, let's get to work. The composition book sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Gideon said anything to anyone outside the ranch about what was in it. He wasn't a man who moved fast on things that mattered. That was a quality some people mistook for slowness, and he'd stopped bothering to correct them. Moving fast on something you didn't understand was how you made it worse. And what Rosalind had documented in those pages was complicated enough that he wanted to be sure he understood every piece of it before he opened his mouth in a room with other people in it. So he read it again, and then a third time, sitting at the table after supper while she went over the cattle records and Tom and Cale had retired to the bunkhouse. He read it with a pencil and marked the parts that needed more information and the parts that seemed to connect to each other in ways she hadn't explicitly noted. And by the end of the third reading, he had a picture in his mind that was ugly and specific and made a particular kind of sense the way ugly things sometimes do when you've lived long enough to recognize the shape of greed. The water rights are the center of it, he said one evening, not looking up from the page. Rosalind looked up from her own work. Yes. Everything else? The false debt assessments, the forged surveys, the notes getting sold to Croft's holding company, it all pushes the ranchers off the land. But the water rights are what he actually wants. Whoever controls the Cimarron allocation controls the valley, she said. You can own land all the way to the horizon, and without water access, you're raising dust. Gideon set down his pencil. He's been doing this 7 years, since he bought the Larson spread and got himself onto the water board. At least 6 that I can document, Rosalind said. There may be more before I started keeping records. How many families? She was quiet for a moment. 9 that I'm certain of. 3 more that I suspect but can't prove yet. 9 families. 9 operations in a valley that maybe held 40 ranches of any size. That wasn't opportunism. That was a plan. We need to talk to Stearns, Gideon said, and the Kinneys, and I want to find out more about the Delacroix situation with the holding company. They'll talk to you, Rosalind said, and the way she said it, careful and neutral, carried the thing she wasn't saying, which was that they might not talk to her. They'll talk to both of us, he said. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring quality she had, the one that wasn't distrust but wasn't quite trust either, the look of someone who'd learned to check the ground before they put their weight on it. All right, she said. Obadiah Stearns lived 6 miles north of the Cimarron on land that his father had homesteaded in 1861. He was 53 years old and looked it, a lean, hard-used man with hands like barnwood and eyes that had done a lot of squinting into a lot of wind. He met them in his yard with the particular wariness of a man who'd recently learned he'd been fooled and hadn't finished being angry about it. He shook Gideon's hand. He nodded at Rosalind once, which was more than some would have done. They sat on the porch. Stearns' wife brought out water and then went back inside, which Gideon understood was her way of giving her husband room to talk. I signed papers I shouldn't have signed, Stearns said. He said it with the flat self-disgust of a man who prided himself on not being stupid and had been made to feel stupid anyway. Man came out here in a county surveyor's coat, had official paper with the county seal on it, or what looked like the county seal. Said there'd been a complaint from a downstream property owner about the accuracy of my water allocation, standard reassessment procedure, didn't need a lawyer, just a signature acknowledging the preliminary findings. Did he leave you a copy? Rosalind asked. Stearns looked at her. No, said I'd get a copy once the assessment was finalized. And when you went to the county clerk... No record, Stearns said. Nothing. Clerk looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He rubbed his jaw. I've been on this land 30 years. My father was on it before me. And now I've got a water allocation that's been cut in half by a paper I can't find any record of. And a man at the bank who keeps suggesting that with reduced water access, maybe it makes sense to consider selling before the dry season. What man at the bank? Gideon asked. New loans officer, name of Prewitt. Came in 6 months ago. Stearns' jaw tightened. Young fellow, real friendly. Rosalind had her own composition book out. She'd been writing without asking permission, just quietly noting what Stearns said, and he'd noticed but hadn't objected. Now she looked up. Did Prewitt suggest a buyer? She asked. Stearns looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. She'd asked the right question, and they both knew it. Cimarron Basin Properties, he said. Rosalind wrote it down. What price did he quote? 60 cents on the dollar of the last official assessment, before the water rights revision. Stearns shook his head. I told him to get off my porch. Good, Gideon said. Don't know how much longer I can hold out, though, Stearns said, and the anger went out of his voice and something older came in under it. Half my water allocation means I can't run the herd I've been running. I cut 10 head this summer already. If next summer's dry—" He stopped. "My wife's been talking about her sister in San Antonio. I haven't told her I'm thinking about it too." The porch was quiet for a moment. A dust devil spun up in the yard and collapsed. "Don't do anything yet," Gideon said. "Don't sign anything. Don't sell anything. Don't let Pruitt back onto your property. Can you give us some time?" Stearns looked at him. "How much time?" "I don't know yet," Gideon said, which was honest, "but we're talking to other people in the valley, and we're keeping records." He glanced at Rosalind. "Good records." Stearns was quiet. Then he looked at Rosalind directly for the first time. "You're the one who kept the Mercer place running," he said. "Yes," she said. "Blackridge tried to buy it out from under you. Twice." He chewed on that. "You knew what you were looking at, didn't you, from the start?" "I had a suspicion," she said. "It took time to be sure." He nodded slowly, and Gideon could see him making some kind of internal adjustment, the way a man does when he realizes the picture he had wasn't the right one. "I'll wait," Stearns said. "Talk to the Kinneys. And talk to Luther Hames. He's got land on the South Branch. Been in trouble with the bank for 2 years. He thinks it's his own fault, but I don't think it's his own fault anymore." The Kinneys were harder. Bill Kinney was a proud man, and pride had curdled in him under pressure into something brittle and defensive. He met them at his gate and didn't invite them in, and the first 10 minutes of the conversation were mostly him explaining why his situation was under control and he didn't need anyone poking around in his business. His wife Martha stood in the background near the house. She'd been the one to mention it to Rosalind at the dry goods, Gideon remembered. She stood with her arms folded and watched her husband with an expression that said she'd been having a different version of this conversation with him at home for months. "Bill," Rosalind said, in a tone that didn't argue with his pride, but didn't accommodate it either. "I'm not here to help you. I'm here because whatever's happening to you is happening to 9 other families in this valley, and if we don't start talking to each other, it's going to keep happening." Kinney looked at her with the complicated irritation of a man who didn't like being addressed plainly by a woman, but couldn't find a factual objection to what she'd said. 9 families, he said, at minimum. He was quiet. Behind him, Martha Kinney unfolded her arms. "Bill," Martha said, "let them in." He let them in. It took 2 hours and considerable patience, but what came out of it was specific and damning. The Kinneys had received a letter 8 months ago from a law firm in Austin. Not Gerald Croft's firm, a different one, though Rosalind wrote the name down carefully, claiming that the deed on a portion of their land contained a clerical error from the original survey that had given them acreage that technically belonged to an adjacent property, since sold to Cimarron Basin Properties. The letter offered to settle the matter quietly with a deed correction and a modest payment, rather than going to a county court where a formal challenge would be costly and uncertain. "We almost signed it," Martha said quietly. "We were scared." "What stopped you?" Rosalind asked. "I went to look at the original survey," Martha said. "In the county archives. The deed is exactly what it's supposed to be. There's no error. There never was an error." She looked at her husband, and her voice had something in it that wasn't anger but was close to it. The sound of a woman who'd been carrying more fear than she should have had to. "They made it up, the whole thing." Kinney's jaw was working. He was a man being remade in front of them, the confidence stripped back down to what was actually underneath, which was a rancher who'd built something over 30 years and was watching someone try to take it from him through paperwork and legal language he didn't fully understand. "What do we do?" he asked. It cost him something to ask it. Gideon could tell. "Keep everything," Rosalind said. "Every letter, every document, every communication. Write down the dates and names of every interaction you've had with anyone from that law firm or from the bank. Don't respond to the letter and don't destroy it." She paused. "And don't talk about this conversation to anyone you're not certain of." "Why not?" She looked at him evenly. "Because someone's been talking," she said. "I don't know who, but Blackridge has been 2 steps ahead of some people in this valley, and the most likely reason is that he has someone telling him who's getting uncomfortable." The room was quiet enough that they could hear the clock on the mantel. They rode home in the late afternoon, the sun getting that horizontal quality that made the Texas flats look like they were lit from the side, every weed and fence post throwing a long shadow east. Gideon was tired in the specific way he got tired when he'd spent a long time listening carefully, the particular drain of paying close attention to people in pain. There's an informant, he said. Probably, Rosalind said, or just someone who talks without realizing what they're telling. Either way, we keep the circle tight. Yes, she wrote a few strides. Gideon. It was the first time she'd used his name like that. Not attached to a sentence, just his name, to get his attention because she was about to say something she'd thought about. What? This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said. When Blackridge figures out we're talking to people in the valley, he's not going to just wait. He's going to push. I know. And the easiest thing to push on is me, she said. Whatever he can say about me, whatever story he can get people believing, it's going to be easier for people to doubt me than to doubt him. He's established. He's known. She stopped. I'm not. Gideon looked at her. The light was doing something to her face that he noticed and then looked away from, because this wasn't the moment for that kind of noticing. Then we make sure that what we're bringing people isn't your word against his, he said. It's documents, it's records, it's their own experience, written down and witnessed. He paused. That's what you started building 14 months ago without knowing you'd need it. She was quiet for a moment. I knew I might need it, she said. I just didn't know for what. The rumors started in October. Gideon heard the first one from Cale Ridley, who'd heard it in the saloon from a drover passing through, which meant it had come from somewhere specific and traveled to him by the longest possible route to make it hard to trace back. The story was that Rosalind Avery had been run off a ranch in Laredo for theft, that she'd stolen from her employer and then manipulated her way onto the Mercer property by presenting false documents to the bank, that the records she'd kept were fabricated, numbers doctored to make a failing operation look successful, that Gideon Mercer, having been away 2 years, didn't know his own ranch well enough to see he was being deceived. It was a careful story. It covered the things that were hardest to disprove. You can't easily demonstrate the absence of a theft record in another county to people who don't want to believe you. And it attacked her credibility at exactly the point where her credibility mattered most, which was the documentation she'd been building. Gideon went to Braxton the next day and spent the morning talking to people. Not confrontationally, just talking, the way he'd always talked to the men and women he'd known for years in this town. He asked questions. He listened to how people answered. He paid attention to who'd already heard the story and who hadn't. By noon, he had a reasonable sense that the story had originated somewhere close to the bank, which meant somewhere close to Prewitt, which meant somewhere close to Croft, which meant somewhere close to Blackridge. The chain was obvious once you knew what to look for. He went to Horton's old office. Ferris was there, the young manager who'd replaced Horton, and sat down across the desk from him. Your new loans officer, Gideon said. Prewitt. Ferris looked cautious. What about him? Where'd he come from? He came recommended from the regional office in Austin. Who made the recommendation? Ferris shifted. I'm not certain I recall. I think you do, Gideon said. Not aggressively, just directly. Ferris looked at the desk for a moment. He was young, maybe 26, and had the look of a man who'd taken a job that was turning out to be more complicated than he'd been led to believe. Mr. Blackridge's office made a general recommendation to the regional office, Ferris said quietly. Prewitt came out of that. He looked up. I want you to know that I'm not comfortable with some of what's been happening, but I'm not in a position to. I'm not asking you to do anything, Gideon said. I'm just asking you to know what I know. He stood up. And to understand that I'm keeping records. He said it the same way Rosalind had said it to the man from the bank 14 months ago, and he thought she'd probably be satisfied with how it landed. The night the trouble came to the ranch, it was a Tuesday in late October, and cold enough that the hands were sleeping deep. Gideon woke to the dogs. He kept 2 cattle dogs, both of them useless as alarm systems except for exactly this kind of thing. They had a particular bark for something wrong at the perimeter, different from their standard night noise, and he was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully awake. He came out the front door with his rifle and found Tom Ridley already in the yard, also with a rifle, looking toward the south pasture. The smell hit him before he saw it. Smoke. It wasn't the house or the barn. He'd have known that from the size of it. It was the south fence line, a section of the wooden post that had been there since he'd built the property, old dry wood that someone had set alight. Cale went for water. Tom went for the horses. Rosalind came out of the back of the house and took one look at the situation and went straight for the second bucket rather than stopping to ask questions, which Gideon marked somewhere in his mind as the behavior of someone who'd faced bad situations before and knew that talking came after. They got it out. It took 40 minutes and left them all smelling of smoke and ash, and took out a 40-foot section of fence that would need replacing. No cattle had got through. The section that burned was on the far end of the south pasture where the herd didn't graze at night. Gideon walked the fence line with a lamp afterward. The fire hadn't started itself. "Someone set it," Tom said behind him. "Someone set it in the section least likely to cause real damage," Gideon said. "This wasn't about hurting the cattle. It was a message." "What kind of message?" Rosalind was standing a few feet back from them, looking at the burned posts. In the lamplight, her face was unreadable. "The kind that says we know where you are," she said quietly. Nobody answered that. They went back inside when the fire was cold and the fence line was secured with wire strung between the remaining posts. The Ridley brothers went back to the bunkhouse. Rosalind made coffee because nobody was going back to sleep, and they both knew it. They sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee and didn't talk for a while. "Are you scared?" he asked her finally. She held her cup with both hands. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. And he respected that, the flat honesty of it, the refusal to perform toughness she didn't feel. "So am I," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "Are you thinking about stepping back from this?" "No." "Because it would be reasonable," she said. "This is my fight in a lot of ways. You came home to a ranch, not to a war. I came home to a ranch that exists because of what you did," he said, "and to a valley being eaten alive by a man who thinks nobody's going to stop him." He set down his cup. "That makes it my fight, too." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her turning that over, checking it for sincerity the way she checked everything. It wasn't distrust. It was the careful habit of someone who'd been told things that turned out not to be true and had learned to look closer. Whatever she found when she looked, she seemed to accept it. "All right," she said. She said that word to him often, he was realizing. "All right." It was the word she used when something had been offered and tested and found to hold. It wasn't enthusiasm. Rosalind Avery was not a woman given to enthusiasm. But it was something more reliable. It was the word she used for yes when she meant it. Outside, the last of the smoke smell drifted off on the night wind. The cattle settled. The dogs went quiet. The Cimarron ran somewhere to the north in the dark, cold, and steady, indifferent to the schemes of men, carrying water to whoever was strong enough to hold their claim to it. Gideon refilled his cup and looked across the table at the woman who had refused to leave this land when leaving would have been so much easier. He thought about what Stearns had said, what the Kinneys had told them, what 9 families in this valley were living with quietly, each one thinking they were alone in it. They weren't alone in it. That was the thing Blackridge had counted on and gotten wrong. People who were alone didn't make records. They didn't sit at kitchen tables after midnight mapping the connections between forged surveys and holding companies. They didn't ride out to neighboring ranches and ask the right questions and write down the answers in a small, careful hand in a composition book that was getting thicker by the week. Rosalind turned a page in the book and kept writing. He watched her for a moment, then picked up his pencil and pulled the map toward him. A rough sketch of the valley he'd started making, marking each property, each known incident, each family they'd spoken to. They worked until the sky started to lighten in the east, and the shape of what they were building between them became a little clearer, a little harder, a little more like something that might hold. The Valley Ranchers Assembly met 4 times a year in the Braxton Feed Store, which was the largest indoor space in town that wasn't a saloon. The owner, a heavy-set man named Cord Ellison, would push the feed sacks to the walls and set out chairs, and whoever had business with the community would bring it there. It wasn't a legal body. It had no formal authority. But in a frontier valley where the nearest county courthouse was a 2-day ride and the nearest judge even farther, the assembly was the closest thing to collective voice that the ranching community had. And what got decided in that room had a way of becoming fact on the ground, whether it was written down anywhere or not. The November assembly was 3 weeks after the fire on the south fence line. Gideon had been thinking about it since October. Rosalind had been thinking about it longer than that. He could tell from the way she'd been organizing her records in the weeks since their ride out to the Stearns place and the Kinneys. A quiet, systematic reorganization that wasn't about keeping track anymore, but about presentation. She was building something meant to be understood by people who hadn't been living inside it the way she had. He raised the idea directly one evening. "The assembly," he said. "November's meeting." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "I've been thinking about it too." "It's the right place," he said. "Everyone's in the same room. You can't be picked off one at a time. You put the whole picture in front of them at once, the forged surveys, the holding company, the bank connection, and it's harder to dismiss than if you're going door to door." "It's also public," she said, "which means Blackridge will be there. He's on the water board. He's always there." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll fight back. In front of everyone." "Yes. And when he does, it won't be about the evidence." She finally looked up. "It'll be about me. What I am, what I'm not. Why no one should believe a word I say." "Probably." She held his gaze. "And you're still saying we should do it." "I'm saying you should do it," he said, "because it's yours. You built it. You understood it first. You documented it. If I stand up there and present your work like it's mine, we lose something that matters." She looked at him for a long moment. He'd said something she hadn't expected, and they both knew it, and she was doing that thing she did where she checked it carefully before she accepted it. "All right," she said. She spent 2 weeks preparing. It wasn't a performance she was building. She wasn't that kind of person, didn't think in terms of how things would look or land. She was building a case, the same way she built everything else. Methodically, from the ground up, with nothing included that she couldn't support, and nothing left out that needed to be there. She organized the records into a sequence that told the story in the order someone unfamiliar with it could follow. She wrote out summaries of each family's situation on separate pages, names, dates, specific documents, the connection back to Cimarron Basin properties or Gerald Croft's legal work, or Prewitt at the bank. She cross-referenced everything. She made a second copy of the most critical documents, which Gideon rode to the county clerk's office in Braxton and filed for safekeeping without explanation, simply handing them to the clerk and asking for a dated receipt. The clerk, a methodical older man named Aldous Webb, had looked at the papers with a kind of careful blankness that told Gideon he understood more than he was letting on. "These will be secure," Webb said. "I'd like that in writing," Gideon said. Webb wrote it in writing. In those 2 weeks, Rosalind also spoke to Martha Kinney again, and to Stearns' wife, and to a woman named Clara Hames, whose husband Luther had finally confided in Stearns and agreed to talk to them. The women's conversations were different from the ones Gideon had with their husbands. Quieter, more specific, covering the things that women noticed and tracked that men sometimes didn't think to mention, like the fact that Prewitt at the bank had made a point of calling on ranchers' wives when their husbands were out working, or that the original letter to the Kinneys about the false deed error had been addressed to Martha specifically, not to Bill, as though whoever wrote it had calculated that a frightened wife might sign before consulting her husband. Rosalind wrote all of it down. There was one evening, 4 days before the assembly, when Gideon came in late from the north field and found her at the table with the composition book open in front of her and her pen down and her hands folded on the table and her eyes not focused on anything, just sitting. He poured himself water and sat across from her and didn't say anything, because he'd been around her long enough now to know the difference between the stillness that meant she was thinking and the stillness that meant she was tired in a way that didn't have anything to do with physical work. After a minute, she said, "What if they don't believe me?" It wasn't a question, quite. More like something she'd been turning over and had finally said out loud. "Some of them won't," he said. "That's going to be true no matter what you do." "That's not helpful." "It's true, though." He set down his cup. "The question isn't whether every person in that room believes you. The question is whether enough of them do. Whether the ones who've been wondering in private decide they're not alone in it. And if they don't, then we've still put it on the record. We've still filed the documents with Webb. We've still made it harder for Blackridge to keep operating quietly." He paused. "But I think they will." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Stearns looked at you like you'd handed him something he'd been trying to find for a year," he said. "And Kinney let you into his house when he didn't want to let anybody in. And Clara Hames cried, Martha told me. Not because she was scared, because someone finally understood what was happening to her family." Rosalind looked at the composition book. I'm not good at being looked at, she said, standing in front of a room full of people who've already decided what I am. I know. I don't know how to make them like me. I've never known how to do that. You don't need them to like you, he said. You need them to look at the ledgers and recognize their own names in the pattern that you can do. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. All right, she said, and went back to work. The morning of the assembly, Braxton was cold and overcast, the kind of November day that felt like a held breath. The feed store filled up fast. Word had gotten around that there was something unusual on the agenda. Gideon had spoken to enough people in the previous weeks that the community had a sense that something was coming, though not most of them a specific sense of what. Edgar Blackridge arrived 10 minutes before the meeting started, which was his habit. He was a tall man, well-dressed for a frontier town, with the kind of easy confidence that came not from certainty about outcomes, but from long practice at controlling rooms. He had 2 men with him, as he usually did at public gatherings. Not bodyguards exactly, but large, quiet men who stood near him and had the effect of making the space around him feel like his. He saw Gideon near the front and nodded with the particular cordiality of a man who doesn't consider you a threat. He saw Rosalind, and his expression did something small and controlled that only someone watching for it would notice. Then he found his seat near the water board member's table and talked to the man next to him about something unrelated, easy, and unhurried. The meeting ran its early business. Cord Ellison, who chaired it, worked through the standard items. A dispute about a property line on the East Branch, a proposal about road maintenance on the northern track, a report from the water board on Cimarron levels. Blackridge spoke twice during the water board report, both times with authority and precision, citing numbers from documents he produced from his coat pocket. He was good at this. That was the thing about him. He was genuinely good at it. Then Gideon stood up. I'd like to bring something before the assembly, he said. Ellison looked at him. Go ahead, Mercer. I'd like Rosalind Avery to present it, Gideon said. She's done the work and she understands it better than I do. There was a shift in the room, not loud, just a change in the quality of the attention, a slight stiffening in some quarters and a leaning forward in others. Blackridge's expression didn't change at all. Rosalind stood up. She had the composition book and a stack of organized papers, and she dressed practically, as she always dressed, and she looked at the room without apology, which Gideon knew cost her more than she'd let on to anyone. My name is Rosalind Avery, she said. I've been working the Mercer Ranch for the past 15 months. Before that, I managed my family's cattle operation outside of Laredo for 6 years. I know how to read a deed, a water allocation, and a banknote. And over the past several months, I've been documenting a pattern of fraud in this valley that I believe affects at least 9 ranching families in this room, and possibly more. The silence was specific now, the kind that meant people were paying attention. She laid it out methodically, the way she'd organized it, starting with the general pattern. The false surveys, the notes sold to Cimarron Basin properties, the bank connections, and then moving to the specific cases, naming names with each family's prior permission, citing dates and documents. She held up the relevant pages as she cited them without dramatizing it, just showing them the way you'd show someone evidence. Here it is. Look at it. She was 11 minutes into it when Blackridge spoke. Excuse me. His voice was calm and pleasant. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we owe it to this woman to ask, who exactly is she? What standing does she have in this community to be making allegations of this kind? Ellison looked uncertain. She was introduced by Gideon Mercer. Gideon Mercer, who's been back in this valley for 2 months after a 2-year absence, Blackridge said, still pleasantly, and who, I'm told, arrived home to find this woman had moved into his property without documented permission. The arrangement was documented, Rosalind said. I have 30 months of monthly notices filed with the county clerk. Yes, we've heard about your records, Blackridge said, and the pleasantness shifted into something with an edge under it. A woman arrives alone from Laredo. No family, no references, no standing, takes up residence on an abandoned property, and spends a year making records. And now she's here telling this community that the most established rancher and water board member in the valley is a criminal. He paused, and when he continued, there was something almost gentle about it. The gentleness of a man who knows exactly how sharp the blade is. Now, I don't know what she looks like to most of you. But to me, she looks like someone running a very long confidence scheme, and Gideon Mercer looks like the first mark. There was a sound in the room. Not agreement, not disagreement. Something more uncertain than either. The sound of people who'd been about to believe something suddenly being given a reason not to. Rosalind stood still. She let the sound run itself out. She didn't react to it, didn't rush to answer it, just stood there with her papers and her composition book, and her expression composed and waiting. Gideon watched her from his seat and saw her jaw tighten once and then release, which was the only sign. Then she said, "Mr. Blackridge?" Blackridge looked at her with a half smile that said he'd won this. "You just spent 40 seconds talking about what I look like," she said. "You didn't say a word about the documents." She held up the first page. "This is a letter from the law firm of Pierce and Hull in Austin to William and Martha Kinney, dated March the 4th, claiming an error in the Kinney deed that would transfer 17 acres to Cimarron Basin Properties. Bill Martha, is this your letter?" From near the back wall, Bill Kinney stood up slowly. He was a proud man who didn't find this easy. "That's our letter," he said. "Did the county surveyor's office authorize any error review of your deed?" "No," he said. "I checked. There's no record." She set that page down and picked up another. "This is a signed statement from Obadiah Stearns describing a water rights reassessment conducted on his property in August by a man presenting himself as a county official." "Obadiah, is this your statement?" Stearns stood up from the left side of the room. "It is." "Did the county authorize any reassessment of your water allocation?" "No," clerk confirmed it. She kept going. Family by family, document by document, name by name. Luther Hames stood up and confirmed his statement. Clara Hames stood with him, which made it harder to look at. A rancher named Deacon Pruitt, who'd sold his property to Cimarron Basin Properties 6 months ago at a loss he'd thought was his own fault, stood up last, and his voice cracked once before he steadied it. "I didn't know," Pruitt said. I thought I'd mismanaged it. I didn't know any of this until she came to talk to me last week." Blackridge stood up. "This is all very emotional," he said. "But emotion isn't evidence. A stack of personal statements from struggling ranchers looking for someone to blame is not a legal case. And I'll say plainly what others in this room are thinking. This woman has every incentive to create doubt about legitimate business operations because she wants to establish her own position in this valley, and she found a gullible way onto a property. I have the incorporation documents for Cimarron Basin Properties," Rosalind said. Blackridge stopped. "Filed in Austin, 18 months ago," she said. "The registered agent is Gerald Croft. Mr. Croft is your attorney of record in 2 land transactions in this county, both filed at the land office, both public record." She set the page on the table in front of the nearest row of seats so they could see it. "I have the deed transfer on the Pruitt property, sold to Cimarron Basin Properties at 61 cents on the assessed dollar value. I have correspondence between Pruitt at the Braxton Bank and a private address in Austin that routes to the same postal box as Croft's law office. I have the water board record showing that every allocation reduction in the past 3 years on the North Creek has benefited properties either already owned by Cimarron Basin or adjacent to properties currently under debt pressure." She pulled out the last document. "And I have this, a survey report from 18 months ago on the northern Cimarron water flow, which your water board filed as evidence of reduced allocation to the North Creek properties. This report cites a hydrological study conducted by a firm called Western Basin Assessments." She looked at him steadily. Western Basin Assessments was incorporated 4 months before that report was filed. It has never conducted any other hydrological study on record. Its registered agent is Gerald Croft. The room was completely silent. Blackridge's face had done something during the last 2 minutes that it hadn't done before. The pleasantness was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something had gone tight and fixed, the expression of a man recalculating. "You fabricated a hydrological study to justify water allocation reductions that benefited your own holding company," Rosalind said. "And you used those reductions to put pressure on ranchers whose land you then acquired through a subsidiary company that traces back to your own attorney." She looked around the room. "That's not emotion, that's a paper trail." Blackridge spread his hands. "A woman with a grudge and a talent for paperwork can construct any narrative she likes." "I don't have a grudge against you," she said. "I've never met you socially. I've never done business with you. You came to a ranch where I was working and tried to intimidate me into leaving, and when that didn't work, you started telling people I was a thief." Her voice was even. Not angry, past angry, or maybe somewhere beneath it where the anger had compressed into something harder. "I'm not here because of you. I'm here because of them." She gestured at the room. "Because 9 families in this valley have been losing their land piece by piece and thinking it was their own fault. And it wasn't their fault. There was a moment. One of those moments in a room full of people where you can feel the collective weight shifting. Pete Whitmore stood up. He was near the middle of the room, and he stood up the way a man does when he's made a decision he's been putting off for too long. "I've known Gideon Mercer 20 years, he said, "and I watched this woman run his ranch for 14 months without a word of complaint from anyone who actually dealt with her. I sent her my strays twice when they got through the fence, and she handled it straight and honest." He looked around the room. "I'm not saying I understand all of this, but I'm saying she's not what Blackridge is calling her." Then Stern sat down, and a rancher behind him stood up, a quiet woman named Eugenia Ferris, who ran a small operation on the East Branch with her grown son. "My water allocation was reduced last spring," Eugenia said. "I was told it was a county matter and there was nothing to be done. I'd like to know if my name is in those documents." Rosalind looked at her. "Yes," she said. "It is." Eugenia Ferris sat down slowly and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Blackridge with an expression that was very quiet and very specific. Blackridge looked at the room. He was still standing, still composed, but something had shifted in the calculation behind his eyes. "This is not the appropriate venue for these kinds of claims," he said. "If Miss Avery believes she has evidence of wrongdoing, she should take it to the county authorities." "I agree," Rosalind said. "I already have copies filed with County Clerk Webb as of 2 weeks ago." She looked at him. Dated and receipted. Another beat of silence. "I'll also be sending a formal complaint to the State Land Office," she said, "along with a request for an independent audit of water board decisions over the past 4 years. She paused. "I'm telling this room first because these are your neighbors, your community. The land office can open an investigation, but they can't give you back what you've already lost. That's going to require you to make decisions together." Blackridge's lawyer, not Croft, a local man named Dees, who attended all the assembly meetings, leaned up and said something in Blackridge's ear. Blackridge listened and then nodded once, a small, controlled nod. "I think we've heard enough for one evening," Blackridge said. "I intend to consult my legal counsel about the slanderous nature of these allegations." "You should," Rosalind said. "You'll want to be prepared." He looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was something colder and more careful. "You've made a serious mistake, he said quietly. "I've made a lot of them," she said. "This isn't one of them." He gathered his papers and left, his 2 men following, and the room let out a collective breath that it had been holding for several minutes. Gideon was at her side before she'd finished setting her documents back in order. He didn't say anything, just stood close, which was enough. Bill Kinney came through the crowd and stopped in front of her. He was not a man who found certain things easy, and what he said next was clearly one of them. "I should have listened sooner," he said, "when you first came to talk to us." He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. "I'm sorry for that." Rosalind looked at him. "You listened when it mattered," she said. He nodded once and moved away, and Martha Kinney, following him, reached out and briefly touched Rosalind's arm as she passed. It was a small gesture. Rosalind looked down at her own arm after Martha's hand had gone, just for a second, like she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Gideon saw that. He stored it away without comment. The room was buzzing now, the controlled chaos of people who'd been sitting with something private and unspeakable, discovering it was neither. Eugenia Ferris was talking to Deacon Pruitt. Stearns and Luther Hames had their heads together. Cord Ellison was standing by the wall with his arms folded, looking at the door Blackridge had left through, his expression that of a man adding up a column of numbers and not liking the sum. "He's going to move fast," Gideon said quietly. "I know," Rosalind said. She was still sorting her papers, a little mechanical about it, the way people get when their hands need something to do. "We have a window. The county clerk has the copies. If we can get the formal complaint to the state land office before he can interfere with the process, I'll ride for the land office tomorrow morning," Gideon said. She looked up. "It's a 2-day ride." "Then I'll leave tonight." She held his gaze. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her steadily. Let me do this part. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its noise, voices rising and falling, chairs scraping, the sounds of a community that had been handed something it didn't know how to hold yet, but was trying. All right, she said. Outside, the November night was sharp and cold and absolutely clear, the stars hard and bright the way they got when the temperature dropped. Gideon stood in the street for a moment before going for his horse, looking up at the sky and thinking about all the things that could still go wrong, which was a long list, and about the woman inside the feed store who'd stood in front of a room that didn't want to believe her and made them believe her anyway, which was not something you could put on a list because it didn't fit in that kind of container. He went for his horse. The ride to the state land office would take 2 days if he pushed it, and he intended to push it. Behind him, through the lit windows of the feed store, the voices of the valley carried on, changed now, moving differently, like water that had found a new direction and was beginning, slowly and with some turbulence, to flow. Gideon made the ride in a day and a half. He stopped 4 hours outside of Braxton at a way station to water the horse and eat something he didn't taste, and then he kept going through the night with the stars for company and the cold working its way through his coat and the particular kind of focus that comes when you've stopped thinking about whether you're doing the right thing and started thinking only about getting it done. The state land office sat in a 2-story limestone building on the main street of Caldwell, a proper town with gas lamps and a telegraph office, and the kind of ordered civic architecture that made Braxton look like what it was, a collection of buildings that had grown up around necessity rather than plan. Gideon arrived at 7 in the morning, an hour before the office opened, and tied his horse at the rail and sat on the steps and waited. The man who opened the office was named Hargrove. He was a compact, precise bureaucrat in his mid-40s who wore spectacles and moved through his domain with the unhurried authority of someone who understood that paperwork outlasted everything: politicians, ranchers, land barons, and weather. He found Gideon on his steps and looked at him the way a man looks at someone who's clearly ridden through the night on urgent business, which is with a mixture of professional wariness and practical curiosity. Office hours started at 8, Hargrove said. I know, Gideon said. I'll wait. He waited. At 8 o'clock, Hargrove opened the door, and Gideon went in and laid Rosalind's formal complaint on the desk, along with the supporting documents she'd organized, and the dated receipt from County Clerk Webb confirming the copies were on file. Hargrove read in silence for a long time. This is thorough, he said finally, without looking up. The person who prepared it is thorough, Gideon said. The allegations here, if substantiated, Hargrove set the papers down and looked at him over his spectacles. This would be a significant matter. Fabricated surveys, a shell company acquiring distressed properties, water board manipulation. He paused. You understand we'd need to conduct our own investigation. We can't simply act on submitted documents. I understand that, Gideon said. I'm asking you to open one. The man named here, Blackridge, he has standing in his community? He does, which is part of why people didn't ask questions sooner. Hargrove tapped the documents with one finger. There's a family here, Pruitt, who sold their property to this holding company already. 6 months ago, at a significant loss, and they weren't aware their deed situation had been manufactured. No, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who'd seen a lot of paperwork and could tell the difference between documents that had been assembled to confuse and documents that had been assembled to clarify. He looked at Rosalind's work again, the clean organization of it, the cross-referencing, the careful separation of documented fact from stated claim. Who prepared this, he asked. Rosalind Avery. She works my ranch. Hargrove looked at him. Your ranch hand prepared this complaint. She's my ranch manager, Gideon said, and she's the most careful person with records I've ever known. Hargrove considered that. Then he picked up a pen and opened his ledger. I'll log this as a formal complaint and assign it for review, he said. We have an investigator who handles land fraud. His name is Collier. He'll be in contact within 30 days. Can it be sooner? Hargrove looked at him over the spectacles again. I understand urgency, he said. But an investigation that moves before it's ready fails. You want this done right, or you want it done fast? Gideon thought about Obadiah Stern's face, about Deacon Pruitt's voice cracking in the feed store, about 9 families holding their breath. Right, he said. Then let me do my job, Hargrove said, not unkindly. He rode back to Braxton in a day and a half the same way he'd ridden out, and arrived home in the early morning to find Rosalind already in the yard, which didn't surprise him. She'd have known roughly when to expect him. She looked at his face first before she said anything, which was something he'd noticed she did, reading the information before asking for it. He took it, she said. He took it. 30 days for an investigator. She absorbed that. 30 days is a long time. I know. Blackridge will know a complaint was filed. He has connections in Caldwell. Probably. Gideon unsaddled his horse. What happened here while I was gone? Her expression did something careful. Dees came by, she said. Blackridge's local attorney. He left a letter. What did it say? That the allegations made at the assembly constitute defamation. That unless a full retraction is published in writing and distributed to all assembly members within 7 days, Mr. Blackridge will pursue legal remedy. She paused. It's a threat. There's no actual legal case. What I said was documented fact. But the intent is to make me spend money I don't have defending against a lawsuit I shouldn't have to defend against. Gideon led the horse into the barn. We're not retracting anything. No, she said. We're not. I'll talk to a lawyer in Braxton, somebody who isn't connected to Blackridge. There's only one, she said, a man named Aldridge. He does mostly wills and property transfers. He's not a litigator. He'll know someone who is. Gideon hung the saddle. Don't answer Dee's letter yet. Don't answer it at all until we've talked to Aldridge. She nodded. She was standing in the barn doorway with her arms crossed against the morning cold, and she looked tired in a way she didn't usually let show. Not physically tired, something else. The particular tiredness of waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Tom and Cale have been good, she said. Cale wanted to ride into town and say something to Dees, which I told him would not be helpful. Right call. He argued about it for 20 minutes. That sounds right, too. She almost smiled at that. It was a small thing, and it passed quickly, but Gideon had learned to notice the small things with her because they were the real ones. The 30 days were not quiet. Gerald Croft's law firm in Austin sent its own letter to County Clerk Webb, challenging the legitimacy of the filed documents and requesting they be held pending a procedural review. Webb, to his credit, wrote back in careful legal language explaining that the documents had been properly filed, bore all required signatures and dates, and would remain on record in accordance with standard county procedure. He copied his response to the state land office, which Gideon suspected was not an accident. Prewitt at the bank quietly took a leave of absence in the 3rd week after the assembly. Nobody announced it. He was simply not there when Gideon went in to discuss a seasonal matter, and Ferris, the branch manager, said only that Prewitt had taken personal leave and offered no further information, but his expression said enough. Pete Whitmore organized an informal gathering at his ranch the 2nd week, not an official assembly, just neighboring ranchers who'd started talking to each other the way they hadn't before, comparing notes, looking at their own documents with new eyes. Rosalind went. Gideon went. The Stearns came, and the Kinneys and Clara and Luther Hames and Eugenia Ferris and 4 other families they hadn't spoken to directly, but who'd been listening at the assembly and had since found their own reasons to be concerned. It was not a comfortable meeting. Several people were frightened. One man, a rancher named Craddock, who ran a small operation near the Cimarron's North Fork, said plainly that he thought they were all making a mistake, that Blackridge had lawyers and money and connections, and they had a stack of papers and the good intentions of a woman nobody in the county had heard of 18 months ago, and that taking on a powerful man in a frontier valley was a good way to lose everything you'd been working 30 years to build. Nobody shouted at him. Gideon respected that about the room. People listened to Craddock and let him finish. Then Rosalind said, "You might be right." Craddock looked at her. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you this is certain." Miss Stern, she said. "I don't know what Collier's investigation will find, or how far up the chain it goes, or whether there are people in Caldwell who will try to slow it down. I don't know if Blackridge can get the complaint buried before it reaches anyone with the authority to act on it." She looked around the room, and there was something in her face that Gideon had seen before. The honesty that she gave people in place of reassurance, because she'd decided a long time ago that honesty was the more respectful thing. What I know is that you have documented evidence of fraud, and if you don't use it, it doesn't matter how good it is. The only way it matters is if you stay in this room together. Craddock was quiet for a moment. And if we do, and it still goes wrong? Then at least you'll know you tried, she said. That's not nothing. He thought about that. He was a stubborn, private man, and this kind of public solidarity didn't come naturally to him, and Gideon could see the conflict working through him. All right, Craddock said finally. I'll stay. It's skid. Collier arrived on the 22nd day. He was not what Gideon had expected. He'd expected someone with the rigid official bearing of a government man on assignment. What arrived was a lean, weathered figure of about 50 who rode a plain brown horse and dressed like a working rancher and had watchful gray eyes that moved around a room the way a surveyor's instrument moves, methodically, missing nothing. He introduced himself as State Land Investigator Daniel Collier, and he shook hands with Gideon and then with Rosalind, and when he shook her hand, he said, "You prepared the complaint," as a statement, not a question. "Yes," she said. "I've read it 4 times," he said. It's the clearest land fraud documentation I've received in 11 years of this work." Rosalind looked at him. "Is that enough?" "It's enough to open a serious investigation," he said. "Whether it's enough to prosecute depends on what I find when I start pulling the threads." He looked between them. "I need 2 things from you. First, access to your original documents, not copies, originals where possible. Second, I need to speak with the families involved. Separately, individually. I need their own accounts." "They'll talk to you," Gideon said. "We've already spoken to all of them." "I know," Collier said. "I need to hear it from them directly regardless." He spent 4 days in Braxton County. He rode to every property on the list, sometimes with Gideon, mostly alone. He spent an afternoon with County Clerk Webb going through the archived filings, and another afternoon at the land office in Braxton reviewing deed transfers and water board records. He was methodical and unhurried, and asked questions that went sideways of what Gideon expected, into corners of the situation that he hadn't thought to examine. On the 4th evening, Collier sat at the kitchen table with Rosalind's documents spread before him and his own notes alongside them, and he looked at the picture they made together with the expression of a man who'd been doing this long enough to recognize a specific kind of architecture. "Blackridge has been building this for close to 8 years, Collier said. "What you documented is the middle phase. The early acquisitions before he had the water board position were cleaner, legitimate purchases from ranchers in genuine distress. He was patient. He established himself as a legitimate operator before he started using the mechanisms." He tapped one of the pages. "The false surveys are the most prosecutable element. Those are forgeries, full stop. The shell company isn't illegal on its face. It's the combination of the water board manipulation and the shell company acquisitions that creates the conspiracy." "Will it hold?" Gideon asked. Collier looked at him. "What do you mean?" "In a court, against a man with his resources." Collier was quiet for a moment. "That depends on the state attorney's office," he said. "My job is to document and refer. What they do with the referral is outside my control." He looked at Rosalind. "I want you to understand that going into this." "I understand it," she said. "If it goes to prosecution, you'll likely be required to testify. It'll be public. Blackridge's attorneys will try to discredit your documentation and your character." "They've been trying to discredit my character for a year," she said. "I'm still here." Collier nodded once. Something in his expression said he appreciated that she didn't make it sound easy when it wasn't. "There's one more thing," he said. He pulled a document from his own case. "The Pruitt property. The sale to Cimarron Basin. There's a provision in state land law, I checked before I came out here, that covers acquisitions made under documented fraudulent duress. If the fraud can be established, the sale can potentially be voided and the property restored. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible." The kitchen was quiet. Rosalind looked at the document in Collier's hands. "Deacon Pruitt," she said quietly. "He thought it was his fault." "I know." "His wife," she said. "She stopped coming to town after they sold. Martha Kinney told me." Collier set the document on the table between them. "Tell them," he said. "Don't promise anything, but tell them it's possible." The state attorney's office moved in January, 6 weeks after Collier's visit. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about legal processes that people who'd never been through one didn't understand. It wasn't a door swinging open. It was a series of small doors, each one requiring its own key, and you couldn't see the next door until you'd gotten through the one in front of you. The first movement was a subpoena for the records of Cimarron Basin properties served to Gerald Croft's law office in Austin. Croft complied, which surprised Gideon until Rosalind pointed out that not complying would have been worse for Croft personally, and Croft's primary loyalty was always going to be to Croft. The second movement was a formal suspension of Edgar Blackridge from the Braxton County Water Board pending investigation, announced by the county commissioner in a brief notice that was posted at the land office and the courthouse and the feed store. Blackridge's two allies on the water board both declined comment. The third seat was filled on an interim basis by Obadiah Stearns, who accepted it with the gravity of a man who understood what it meant and was not going to waste it. Blackridge himself had gone quiet in the weeks since the assembly. He was still in the valley, still at his property on the old Larson spread, but the public presence had contracted. He wasn't attending community gatherings. His men were keeping to the property. Gideon heard from Pete Whitmore that there'd been a succession of visitors from Austin, lawyers most of them, riding out to the Larson spread and staying a day or two before leaving again. "He's building a defense," Rosalind said when Gideon told her. "Can he build one that works?" She thought about it. "Not against the forged surveys," she said. "Those are the clearest. Western Basin Assessments incorporated 4 months before the report it supposedly conducted. That's not a clerical error, that's a fabrication. Everything else he can argue was legitimate business. The surveys he can't. His lawyers will argue he didn't know, that Croft acted independently. Maybe, she said, but Croft is not going to carry this alone, and the water board decisions tie directly back to Blackridge personally. He made those votes, he signed those allocation revisions. Croft can't have made those for him. She was right, as she generally was about these things. The unraveling, when it came from Croft. Gideon heard it from Collier, who rode back to Braxton in late February with the particular expression of a man delivering complicated news. Croft made a deal, Collier said. They were in the kitchen again, the three of them, the February cold making the house feel smaller and closer than it did in summer. Full cooperation with the state attorney's investigation in exchange for reduced charges against himself. He's provided testimony and documents covering 8 years of the operation. He paused. All of it, the survey forgeries, the holding company mechanics, the bank coordination, the false deed challenge to the Kinneys. He kept records of everything. Blackridge insisted on it, apparently. Complete documentation of every transaction. Rosalind set down her cup. Blackridge insisted on written records. The irony isn't lost on me, Collier said. He thought the records protected him, she said slowly. If everything was documented, he had proof it was all legitimate business. He just never expected anyone to look at the pattern. That's my read, Collier said. The records are as thorough as yours, in a different way. Together they tell the complete story from both directions. Gideon leaned back in his chair. What happens now? State attorney is filing formal charges next week. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit land theft, manipulation of a public water authority. Collier looked at Rosalind. They'll need your original documents as evidence. You'll be listed as a primary complainant and likely called as a witness in the proceedings. When? Spring term of court. April, maybe May. And the properties? Rosalind asked. The families who lost land. That's civil, not criminal, Collier said. The criminal charges are the state's case. The property restorations will require separate action by the affected families, though the state's findings will support those actions significantly. He paused. The Pruitt property is the most straightforward case under the fraudulent duress provision. The others may take longer. Some of what was taken may not come back. That was the hard part. Gideon had known it was coming, that justice and complete restoration weren't the same thing, and that some of what Blackridge had taken was gone in ways that a court ruling couldn't entirely undo. Deacon Pruitt might get his land back, but he wouldn't get back the 6 months he'd spent believing it was his own failure that lost it. Craddock wouldn't stop being afraid overnight. The Cimarron Water Board would need rebuilding, and trust, once broken in a community, grew back slowly and unevenly. Still, it's enough, Gideon said. What you've built here. It's enough to matter. Collier looked at him. The complaint was enough, he said. Someone had to file it first. He looked at Rosalind. That was the hard part. She was looking at the table. There was something in her expression he recognized. The look of a person who's finished carrying a weight they'd been carrying for so long that the absence of it felt strange. There were 9 families, she said quietly. There were 9 families who came forward, Collier said, because of the work you did. He picked up his hat from the table. I've been doing this 11 years, and I want you to know what you put together, without legal training, without authority, without anyone telling you to, that's not ordinary. She looked up at him. It was visible, the work she did to receive that, the old habit of not quite accepting it, but she held his gaze and said, Thank you. He nodded and put his hat on and left. After his horse had faded down the track, the house was very quiet. Gideon started to say something and then didn't because there wasn't anything to say that was equal to the moment, and he'd learned with her that silence was sometimes the more honest thing. She got up after a while and went to the window and looked out at the ranch. The straight fence lines, the south pasture where the cattle moved in the thin February light, the kitchen garden she'd put in off the east side of the house, dormant now under the winter cold, but there, established, rooted. Deacon Pruitt's wife, she said. I want to ride out and tell them. We'll go tomorrow, he said. She turned from the window. We? You shouldn't have to do it alone. She looked at him for a long moment and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not with any performance of feeling, just something that had been held carefully for a very long time, loosening its grip, just slightly, just enough. All right, she said. Ook. Spring came early that year. By March, the Cimarron was running well, and the new interim water board, Stearns, Eugenia Ferris, and a steady rancher from the South Branch named Hugh Calloway, had reviewed and restored 7 of the 9 wrongfully reduced water allocations. The other 2 required additional survey verification, which Collier's office was facilitating. It wasn't fast. It wasn't without friction. Eugenia Ferris had to sit through 2 meetings where men older than her tried to talk over her before they stopped trying, which Gideon heard about from Pete Whitmore, who told it with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed it personally. Blackridge's formal charges were filed in March. He appeared in county court in Caldwell with 3 attorneys and said nothing that was reported in the brief notice in the Braxton Weekly paper, which was the only record most people in the valley had of the proceedings. His properties, the expanded Larson spread, 3 acquired parcels along the Cimarron, the Pruitt land, were frozen pending the outcome of the criminal case and the civil actions filed by 4 of the affected families, including the Pruitts. Gideon and Rosalind rode out to tell Deacon Pruitt and his wife in February, the day after Collier left. It was a cold ride, and the Pruitt place, when they got there, had the feel of somewhere that had been let go. Not neglect exactly, but the loss of care that happens when people have stopped believing their work is building toward something. Clara Pruitt answered the door. She was a small, contained woman who had the look of someone who'd been crying quietly and alone for long enough that she'd gotten used to it. Rosalind told them what Collier had said, clearly and without exaggeration. Possible, not certain. A real possibility, not a promise. Deacon Pruitt sat in his own kitchen and put his face in his hands. His wife stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder and looked at Rosalind with an expression that was complicated and raw and grateful in a way that words weren't built for. We thought it was us, Clara said. For 6 months. We thought that we weren't good enough at this. You were good enough, Rosalind said. The system was rigged against you. That's different. It sounded simple. It wasn't simple. It was the thing Rosalind understood better than anyone else in the valley, Gideon thought. The particular damage of being made to believe that someone else's scheme was your own failure, and how long that damage lasted even after the truth came out. On the ride home that evening, the sun going down red and cold over the flat ground, Gideon looked at the valley spread out around them, the Cimarron catching the last light, the ranch buildings visible in the distance, the land that had been hurt and was beginning slowly and imperfectly to heal. It's not over, Rosalind said. She was reading his silence, as she'd gotten good at doing. No, he said, but it's different now. The court case will be ugly, probably, and some of what was taken won't come back. No, he said, It won't." She was quiet for a moment, writing with her eyes on the horizon. "But Stearns has his water," she said, "and the Kinneys signed nothing, and Clara Pruitt knows it wasn't her fault." She paused. "That's not nothing." "That's not nothing," he agreed. They rode the rest of the way home in the particular companionable silence they'd developed over months. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who'd said enough important things to each other that the quiet between them had become something they could both live inside. The ranch lights came up ahead of them in the early dark, warm and steady, the way lights look when there's something worth coming home to. The trial ran 4 days in the Caldwell courthouse. In the second week of May, Gideon and Rosalind rode down together, arriving the evening before the first session and taking rooms at the only hotel in town that didn't smell of the stockyards. The Kinneys came. Stearns came. Eugenia Ferris came with her son. Deacon Pruitt came with Clara, who sat through every session in the same gray dress with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, like a woman who had decided that the least she could do for herself was witness this in person. The courthouse was a proper building, limestone and timber, with high windows that let in the May light, and a gallery that filled up each morning with people who had no direct stake in the proceedings, but understood that what was being decided mattered beyond the names on the charging documents. Frontier communities had a way of knowing which stories were just individual trouble and which ones were everyone's trouble. This one, by now, was understood to be everyone's. Edgar Blackridge sat at the defense table with his 3 attorneys and said very little, which was a discipline Gideon recognized. The discipline of a man who'd been advised not to perform his confidence in a room where his confidence was the thing on trial. He looked older than he had at the assembly. Not diminished exactly, but reduced, the way things get reduced when the context they depended on has been removed. In Braxton, with his waterboard seat and his social standing and the accumulated weight of 7 years of careful positioning, he'd been a large figure. In a Caldwell courtroom, with Croft's testimony on record and Rosalind's documents in evidence, he was just a man who'd been caught. Rosalind testified on the second day. She was on the stand for 3 hours, and Gideon sat in the gallery and watched her and thought about the woman who told him she wasn't good at being looked at, standing now in front of a full courtroom and a judge, and 3 defense attorneys whose job was to find the crack in her, and being not fearless, because she wasn't fearless, he knew that, but steady, absolutely steady, the way a fence post is steady when it's been set properly in solid ground. The defense attorney who cross-examined her was good at his work. He tried 3 different approaches in the space of an hour. First challenging the completeness of her documentation, then suggesting she'd had a personal motive to fabricate the waterboard pattern, then implying her presence on the Mercer property had been irregular from the start, and cast doubt on her credibility as a witness. Rosalind answered each line of questioning the same way she'd answered Blackridge at the assembly. Without heat, without hurry, pointing back to the documents, naming the specific page and date and source for every claim. The third time, the attorney circled back to the question of her standing. The judge, a heavy-set woman named Anita Voss, who had the bearing of someone with very little patience for time-wasting, cut him off. "Counsel," Judge Voss said, "the witness's employment history has been established. The documents she prepared have been admitted into evidence and verified by the state investigator. Unless you have a specific factual challenge to a specific document, I'm going to ask you to move forward." The attorney moved forward. When Rosalind stepped down from the stand, she walked back through the courtroom with her eyes forward and took her seat next to Gideon and sat very still for a moment with her hands in her lap. "You all right?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. Then after a moment, "My hands won't stop shaking." He looked down. They were, slightly. "That's allowed," he said. She looked at her own hands like they'd betrayed her and then folded them together and made them stop. Croft's testimony, delivered by deposition since he'd struck his deal in Austin, was read into the record by the court clerk on the 3rd day. It took 2 hours. Gideon watched the gallery as it was read and watched the faces of the ranchers who'd come down from Braxton County, watched them hear their own names in the testimony, the specific schemes that had been applied to each property, the calculations Blackridge and Croft had made about which families were most vulnerable, which had the fewest resources to fight back. There was something specific about hearing your own name in a criminal proceeding. Not your name as a victim exactly, but your name as a person someone had assessed and targeted. It sat differently than abstract fraud. It sat personally. Bill Kinney's jaw worked the whole time the clerk read the section about the false deed challenge to his property. Martha reached over and put her hand on his arm, not looking at him, just leaving her hand there. The verdict came on the fourth afternoon. Guilty on 9 of 11 counts. Forgery. Fraud. Conspiracy to manipulate a public water authority. Conspiracy to commit land theft. 2 counts of the original 11 were dismissed on technical grounds that Collier had warned them about beforehand. The early acquisitions, the ones made before Blackridge had fully developed his methodology, that were legitimate purchases even if they'd been made from families who hadn't known they had other options. 9 counts was enough. Judge Voss sentenced Blackridge to 8 years in the state penitentiary and ordered the full financial disgorgement of profits from Cimarron Basin properties to be applied first to restitution for the affected families and second to a new county water authority fund that the interim board could draw from for independent surveys. She also said something from the bench before she closed the proceedings that Gideon would remember for a long time. She looked out at the gallery and at the families who'd come down from Braxton County, and she said, "Fraud of this kind works because it relies on people believing they're alone in their trouble. The fact that this case was made is a result of people deciding they weren't." She didn't look at Rosalind when she said it. She didn't need to. Half the gallery did. On the ride back to Braxton, Rosalind was quiet for a long time, which wasn't unusual, but there was a different quality to the quiet, lighter or maybe just less loaded, like a sky after a long storm has finally passed through. They were maybe an hour out of Caldwell when she said, "It's strange." "What is?" "I thought it would feel bigger," she said, "when it was done." He thought about that. "What does it feel like?" She rode for a moment. "Like a fence that's been repaired," she said. "You know it needed doing. It took a long time. It's right now." She paused. "It just looks like a fence." He understood what she meant. The things you fight for once they're won have a way of settling into the ordinary. The fence stands, the water runs. The families go home. Life doesn't become a different thing. It becomes the same thing, only without the weight you'd been carrying through it. "Deacon Pruitt shook my hand today," she said, "before we left the courthouse. I saw." He held it for a while. She was looking at the road ahead. He didn't say anything. He just held my hand and looked at me. She stopped. I didn't know what to do with that. Gideon looked at her profile against the afternoon sky. "You let him," he said. "I did," she said. Eventually. They rode on. The Texas landscape did its afternoon thing, the light going gold and horizontal, the shadows stretching east, the land taking on that quality. It got toward evening where everything looked more itself than it did in the hard midday light. More honest, somehow. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. She glanced at him. "What do you mean? The thing you came here to do, you've done it. The investigation is finished. The trial is done. The water board is rebuilding." He chose his next words carefully. "You could go anywhere. You've got a reputation now. Collier would write you a reference without hesitating, I'd wager. Any county in this state would want someone who can do what you do." She was quiet for a long moment. "Are you asking me to leave?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm asking what you want." She looked at the road again. He watched her and waited. "I want to go home," she said. He let that sit for a moment. "The ranch." "Yes." "And stay." She didn't answer right away, which he'd learned to read as her taking something seriously rather than dismissing it. "I've been running," she said finally. "A long time, not from anything specific, from the feeling that there wasn't anywhere that was actually mine, that I was always working towards something that belonged to someone else." She paused. "I stayed at your ranch because I couldn't make myself leave, and then I stayed because there was work to do, and then I stayed because—" She stopped. "Because?" he said. She looked at him. "Because it started to feel like mine," she said. "Not because it belonged to me legally. Because I'd put myself into it, my hands and my judgment and I stayed when I could have left. That makes it mine in a way that a deed can't give you and can't take away." He rode for a moment. "I want to make it yours legally too," he said. "Equal ownership. I've been thinking about it for months. It's right. She turned to look at him fully. Gideon, you saved it, he said. You built it into what it is. You've been managing it as well as any person I've ever seen manage land. And you've spent 15 months working a ranch you had no legal claim to because you decided it mattered. He held her gaze. I want to change that. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She was quiet again. He could see her checking it, the habit she had of looking for the crack in something before she let herself trust it. He didn't mind that about her. He'd come to understand it as the flip side of the same quality that had made her keep records for 14 months, that had made her stay at the assembly when Blackridge tried to humiliate her back into silence, that had made her ride to 9 families and ask them to trust her with their worst moments. Rosalind Avery did not do anything halfway or without being sure. Yes, she said at last. He nodded, and they rode on. The paperwork took 3 weeks. Aldridge, the lawyer in Braxton who'd helped them navigate Deese's threat letter back in the fall, handled the deed amendment with the quiet satisfaction of a man doing work that straightened something that had been crooked. He filed it with County Clerk Webb, who receipted it with the same dated precision he'd brought to every document in this affair, and who told Gideon afterward, in the understated way of a man not given to speeches, that he was glad to see it. The ranch was legally the Mercer Avery property from the 15th of June. Rosalind had looked at the amended deed for a long moment when Aldridge handed it to her. Both names, printed in the same ink, equal in size, side by side. She'd folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and gone outside and stood in the street for a minute, looking up at the sky. And Gideon had watched her from the window and given her that minute. Summer came back to the valley hot and certain the way summer always did. The cattle were good. The grass was good. Stern's full water allocation was restored by early June, which he marked by riding over to the Mercer Avery Ranch and shaking both their hands and accepting a cup of coffee and talking about nothing much for an hour, which was its own kind of ceremony. The Pruitt civil case moved forward in the courts, slower than anyone wanted but moving, and by midsummer the preliminary findings had confirmed the fraudulent duress claim on the property. Deacon and Clara Pruitt would get their land back. Not the 6 months of believing it was their failure. That couldn't be given back. But the land itself, yes. The valley's ranching community had changed in a way that didn't have a neat name. It wasn't transformed. People were still people, still stubborn and private and occasionally small about things, still capable of the pettiness and prejudice that frontier life didn't eliminate just because you were all working hard and surviving the same weather. Cord Ellison still looked at Rosalind with a kind of awkward formality that said he hadn't quite sorted out where she fit in his picture of the world. Harlan Dupree at the saloon never acknowledged that he'd been wrong about anything. But the ranchers talked to each other now in ways they hadn't before. The new water board meetings were open in a way the old ones hadn't been, and people came and asked questions and the questions got answered. Pete Whitmore organized 2 more informal gatherings over the summer, and people came, and the conversations were different from the first one. Less fearful, more practical. The conversations of people who'd discovered that working together was more effective than each one managing alone. One evening in late July, Gideon came in from the North Field and found Rosalind at the kitchen table with a new composition book open in front of her. Not the old one, a fresh one, empty pages. "What's that for?" he asked. "The water board's asking for a formal record-keeping system," she said. "Collier recommended they hire someone to maintain it. Stearns asked if I'd be willing. Will you?" She looked at the blank pages. "Part-time. I don't want to leave the ranch work." "You can do both." "I know I can." She looked up at him. "It just means the valley's record-keeping is going to be very thorough." "Braxton County should be so lucky," he said. She almost smiled. The full smile came less rarely than it used to, which was something he'd been watching without noting out loud. Because noting things out loud with Rosalind was a delicate business, and he'd gotten better at knowing when to speak and when to let a thing be. He sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm in the July evening, the window open to the sound of the cattle settling for the night, the sound of the land running the way land runs when it's being properly cared for. There was a question he'd been carrying for a while, not the one about the deed, that had been its own thing, practical and right. This one was different. More personal in the way that the things you actually mean are always more personal and harder to say, and more likely to go wrong if you say them badly. He'd turned it over long enough. "Rosalind," he said. She looked up from the composition book. "I'm not going to dress this up," he said. I'm not good at dressing things up." She set down her pen. Something in her expression changed. Not alarm, but attention. "I've been watching you work for almost a year," he said. "Watching the way you think, the way you make decisions, the way you treat people, even people who didn't treat you decently. And I've been—" He stopped, found the honest words rather than the easy ones. "I've been falling in love with you for about 7 months, and I've been doing a poor job of pretending I haven't." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him with those creek water eyes that had measured him on the first day and had been measuring him, he understood, every day since, checking, verifying, looking for the crack. "You're not pretending," she said. "No." "You haven't been for a while." "No," he said. "I haven't." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. He'd learned to wait with her, that her silences weren't absence but presence, that she was in them, working through something real. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "I want to be honest with you about that. I've been alone a long time, and I know how to work alongside someone. I know how to trust someone with the practical things." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know how to trust someone with the other things. I'm not sure I know how anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to know how all at once." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you want to try," he said. "That's all. Just try. Here, with me. On this land you've half built yourself." He paused. "I'm not a simple man to live alongside. I go quiet when I'm troubled, and I'm stubborn about it. I'm better with cattle than I am with words most of the time. I'm 41 years old and set in habits that aren't all good ones." He said it plainly because she deserved the plain version, not a polished one. "But I'm not going anywhere, and I'm asking if you'll stay. Not because you've got nowhere else to go. You've got options now, real ones, but because you want to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw warm light across the kitchen, across the composition book with its blank pages waiting, across the hands she'd folded on the table the same way she'd folded them in the courtroom gallery when they were shaking and she'd made them stop. "I already told you," she said. "I want to go home." He let out a breath he'd been holding. "That's a yes," she said, and the small curve at the corner of her mouth was real this time, not contained. "I know it's a yes," he said. "I just wanted to hear it." Well, the autumn came in golden and cool, the way the best Texas autumns do, when the heat breaks just enough to make the air feel like a gift after the long summer. The cattle were fat and the grass had recovered well, and the Cimarron ran steadily to the north, feeding the valley the way it was supposed to feed it, unhoarded and unmanipulated, belonging to everyone who worked the land on its banks. Gideon thought sometimes about what Rosalind had said, that justice feels like a repaired fence, just a fence, right and necessary and unremarkable in its rightness. He thought she was correct about that, and also that she'd missed something, which was that the fence being right was precisely the point. A fence that stands isn't a monument. It's just a fence doing what a fence is supposed to do. And the whole life of the ranch can proceed because of it, without anyone having to think about it constantly. The things that are truly fixed become invisible. That was the nature of justice done well. Not a triumph you carried around, just the absence of the weight you'd been carrying, and the ordinary life that became possible in that absence. He'd thought about that in the weeks after the trial, and he thought about it again on a morning in October when he stood at the fence line at the south pasture, the section they'd rebuilt after the fire, solid posts and good wire now, and watched the cattle in the early light and thought about everything that had had to happen for this ordinary morning to be possible. Rosalind came up beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without comment, which was how she did things. Without ceremony, without needing the moment noted. She just stood beside him and drank her coffee and looked at the cattle. "Stearns told me yesterday the North Creek survey came back clean," she said. "Official county surveyor, no connection to anything Black Ridge touched. Allocation confirmed at the original levels." "Good. Eugenia Ferris is expanding her herd," she said. "Bought 4 head from the Hames family. Clara Hames drove them over herself." He looked at her. "Clara Hames drove cattle." "Apparently she used to before us." Rosalind paused. before she stopped believing things could go right. She was quiet for a moment. She looked happy, Eugenia said. He drank his coffee. There were things he had learned in the 2 years since he'd ridden home to find a stranger on his porch with a shotgun that he couldn't have been told and wouldn't have understood if someone had tried to tell him. About the difference between a place you live and a place you belong to. About how belonging isn't given. It's made. With your hands and your decisions, and the particular stubbornness of staying when leaving would be so much easier. About how the people who save things, land, communities, each other, are rarely the people anyone expected, and how the ones who do the most important work are often the ones who had to fight for the right to do any work at all. Rosalind Avery had arrived at a dying ranch with nowhere to go, and a habit of staying that she hadn't entirely chosen. She'd told him that once, that she'd stayed because she'd run out of the energy to leave, which wasn't the heroic origin story anyone would write about her, which was exactly why he believed it. She hadn't saved the Mercer Ranch because she was exceptional. She'd saved it because she was present and competent and honest and stubborn, and because she'd kept records when there was no reason yet to believe the records would matter. And then when they mattered, she'd used them, not for herself, but for 9 families who'd never heard her name. That was the thing about integrity. It didn't announce itself. It just showed up to work every morning and did what needed doing and kept the receipts. He looked out at the south pasture and thought that the most useful thing a person could leave behind them wasn't a monument or a fortune. It was a place that worked. A place where the water ran and the cattle were healthy and the fence lines were straight and the people knew their rights and had the records to prove them. "We should build a bigger barn this winter," Rosalind said, "if we're expanding the herd next year." "I was thinking the same thing. We'll need more hands in spring. I'll talk to Pete." She nodded and drank her coffee. The sun came up fully over the flat horizon and lit the grass from the side, and the cattle moved in the warmth of it, slow and purposeful, the way cattle move when everything is as it should be. Gideon Mercer had come home expecting ruins and found something he hadn't had a word for. He had one now, though he didn't say it out loud because saying things out loud wasn't always how he carried them. He had what every person who'd ever worked hard ground was really working toward. Not the land itself. The land was the medium, not the meaning. What they were working toward was this: a morning in October, coffee going cold in your hand, the person you love standing close enough to touch without you having to reach very far, and the world around you doing the quiet, ordinary work of being all right. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't stay still. There'd be dry years and hard winters and trouble they couldn't yet see coming, because that was the nature of the frontier and the nature of life, and anyone who told you different was selling something. But it was theirs, built honestly, from the ground up, on a foundation of work and records and the decision, made over and over by both of them, in different ways, to stay. That was enough. That had always been enough, if you had the sense to recognize it.